Hello, welcome back to NS channel. Union Budget for the financial year 2025 has revisited and revised the entire capital gain transaction. Tax rules have been changed for mutual funds, stocks, real estate, bonds, etc. In this video, I will untangle the new capital gain tax rules for you in the simplest manner. But before I start, let me request you to subscribe to my channel if you have not done so far. Salient features of the new capital gain tax regime. Tax rules have been changed for mutual funds, stocks, real estate, and bonds. Asset classes, equity funds, debt funds, hybrid funds, exchange traded funds, stocks, real estate, bonds, debentures, physical gold and silver, real estate investment trust that is REITs, and infrastructure investment trust that is InvITs. Overview of changes in the capital gains. Two holding periods, 12 months or 24 months, to determine short-term capital gain or long-term capital gain. For listed securities, the holding period is 12 months, and for all other assets, the holding period is 24 months. Short-term capital gain tax rate increased from 15% to 20% for securities transaction tax paid equity shares, units of equity-oriented mutual funds, and listed REITs and InvITs. Other short-term capital gain will continue to be taxed at the applicable rate. Salient features of the new capital gain tax regime continued. Long-term capital gain tax increased from 10% to 12.5%, but before that it was 10% for STT paid equity shares, equity-oriented mutual funds, business trust, and 20% with indexation for many other assets. Tax exemption of long-term capital gain increased from 1 lakh to 1.25 lakh, applicable only for STT paid equity shares, equity oriented mutual funds, and listed REITs and InvITs. Indexation benefits for certain assets has been removed. There will be parity in taxation for resident and non-resident assessees. All these proposals will come into effect from 23rd July 2024. The budget also modified the taxation of certain funds that were being taxed like debt funds but which were not debt-oriented funds. Funds investing in at least 65% of their assets in debt and money market instruments will be considered as debt-oriented funds. Equity funds invested at least 65% of their assets in Indian equities or stocks. Capital gain is short term if the period of holding is less than 12 months. The tax rate for the transaction effected before 23rd July 2024 is 15% and the tax rate is 20% for the transaction effected after 23rd July 2024. Long term, if the period of holding is more than 12 months and the tax rate is 10% for the transaction effected before 23rd July 2024 with the exemption of 1 lakh in a financial year. The tax rate for the transaction affected after 23rd July 2024 is 12.5% with the exemption increased to 1.25 lakhs in a financial year. Debt funds. Debt funds are those whose debt exposure to debt and money market instruments is at least 65% of their assets. If the funds are purchased after 1st of April 2023, irrespective of the sale date and the period of holding, the capital gain is always short term with the tax applicable at the slab rate. If the purchase date of the fund is before 1/4/2023 and the sale transaction effected between April 2023 to 22nd July 2024 and the holding period was less than 36 months, then it becomes short term and the tax rate is at applicable slab rate. If the transaction period is more than 36 months, then it becomes long term with a tax rate of 20% with indexation. If the sale transaction effected on or after 23rd July 2024 and the holding period is less than 24 months, it becomes a short term with the tax rate applicable at the slab rate. And the holding period was more than 24 months, it becomes long term and the tax rate is 12.5% without indexation. Taxation of capital gain from sale of hybrid funds. Hybrid funds can be divided into three categories: equity oriented with equity exposure of at least 65% or more, debt oriented with debt exposure of at least 65%, equity exposure of at least 35% but less than 65%. Taxation of gain from equity oriented hybrid funds. It is taxed like equity funds. This is applicable for aggressive hybrid, dynamic asset allocation, arbitrage, and equity savings funds. Tax exemption of 1.25 lakhs on long-term capital gain is applicable. Taxation of gain from debt-oriented hybrid funds. It is taxed like debt funds. This is also applicable for conservative hybrid funds. Taxation of hybrid funds with equity exposure of more than 35% but less than 65%. It is taxed depending on when they are sold. Applicable for multi-asset allocation and balanced hybrid funds. If the sale transaction are effected between 1st of April 2023 and July 22nd, 2024, and the holding period was less than 36 months, it is a short-term capital gain and it is taxed at the slab rate. If the holding period was more than 36 months, it becomes long-term and is taxed at 20% post-indexation. If the transactions are effected on or after July 23rd, 2024, if the holding period is less than 24 months, it becomes short term and is taxed at the slab rate. If the holding period was more than 24 months, it becomes long term and is taxed at 12.5%. Taxation of other mutual funds. Gold funds, silver funds, international equity funds, international fund of funds, etc. have been taxed like debt funds. If the fund is purchased after 1st of April 2023 and sold before 1st of April 2025, with respect of the holding period, it is a short-term capital gain and is taxed at the slab rate. Purchased after 1st of April 2023 and the sale date is after 31st March 2025, if the holding period is less than 24 months, it becomes short term and is taxed at the slab rate. If the holding period is more than 24 months, it becomes a long term and is taxed at 12.5%. If the purchase date of the fund is before 1st of April 2023 and the sale date is between April 2023 to 22nd July 24, if the holding period is less than 36 months, it becomes a short term and is taxed at the slab rate. If the holding period is more than 36 months, it becomes a long term and is taxed at the rate of 20% with indexation. If the sale date is after 23rd July 2024, if the holding period is 24 months, it becomes short term and is taxed at the slab rate. If the holding period is more than 24 months, it becomes a long term and is taxed at 12.5% without indexation. Taxation of capital gain from sale of shares. Taxation of listed shares. If the shares were held for a period lesser than 12 months and sold before 23rd July 2024, the tax rate is 15%. If the same is sold after 23rd July 2024, the tax rate is 20%. If the shares were held for more than 12 months and sold before 23rd July 2024, the tax rate is 10% with the exemption of up to 1 lakh for a financial year, and if it is sold after 23rd July 2024, the tax rate is 12.5% with the exemption of up to 1.25 lakhs for a financial year. Taxation of unlisted stocks, including foreign stocks. If the shares were held for a term lesser than 24 months and sold before or after 23rd July 2024, that it is taxed at a slab rate. If the shares were held for more than 24 months and sold before 23rd July 2024, the tax rate was 20% with indexation. If the same shares were sold after 23rd July 2024, the tax rate is 12.5%. Unlisted stocks do not qualify for long-term capital gain exemption of 1.25 lakhs. Taxation of capital gain from sale of listed and unlisted bonds and debentures. In case of listed bonds and debentures, if the bonds were held for a period lesser than 12 months and sold before or after 23rd July 2024, it is taxed at the slab rate. If the bonds were held for more than 12 months and sold before 23rd July 2024, it is taxed at 10%, and the same is taxed at 12.5% if it is sold after 23rd July 2024. In case of unlisted bonds, it is always a short term and the tax rate is at the applicable slab rate. Taxation of capital gain on sale of immovable property. If the property is purchased before 23rd July 2024 and held for 24 months before the sale during the year, it is taxed at the applicable tax rate. If the property was held for more than 24 months and sold before 23rd July 2024, it is taxed at 20% with indexation. If the property was sold after 23rd July 2024, the tax rate is 12.5% without indexation or 20% with indexation for residents only. If property purchased after 23rd July 2024 and sold after 23rd July 2024 and the holding period was lesser than 24 months, it is taxed at the applicable slab rate. If it is sold after 23rd July 2024 and having held for the property for 24 months, then it becomes a long term. The tax rate becomes 12.5% without indexation. Taxation of capital gain from sale of physical gold and silver. For the sale transaction effected before 23rd July 2024 and the holding period of physical gold and silver was lesser than 36 months, it is taxed at the applicable slab rate. If the holding period was more than 36 months, it is taxed at 20% with indexation. If the transactions are effected after 23rd July 2024 and the holding period was lesser than 24 months, it is taxed at the applicable slab rate. If the holding period was more than 24 months, it is taxed at 12.5%. Taxation of capital gain from sale of units of REITs and InvITs. Taxation of listed REITs and InvITs. For the transaction effected before 23rd July 2024, after the holding period of lesser than 36 months, it becomes a short term and is taxed at 15%. If the holding period is more than 36 months, it becomes a long term and is taxed at 10%. For the transaction effected after 23rd July 2024, if the holding period is lesser than 12 months, it becomes a short term and is taxed at 20%. If the holding period is more than 12 months, it becomes a long term and is taxed at 12.5% with the exemption limit up to 1.25 lakhs. Taxation of unlisted REITs and InvITs. For the transaction effected before 23rd July 2024, if the holding period is lesser than 24 months, it becomes a short term and is taxed at the slab rate. If the holding period is more than 24 months, it is taxed at 20%. Transaction effected after 23rd July 2024, if the holding period is lesser than 24 months, it becomes a short term and is taxed at the applicable slab rate, and the holding period is more than 24 months, it becomes a long term and is taxed at 12.5%. Summary of capital gain tax rates. I am presenting in the current slide on the following slide summary of the points that have been discussed so far in the presentation as a recap and to serve you as quick bites. Summary of capital gain tax rates continued. Thanks for watching. With this, we have come to the end of this video. I hope you find this video useful. Please subscribe to my channel by pressing the subscribe button. It will encourage me to post more videos on taxation and investment planning. Thank you.